Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. You're very welcome to today's session. We'd love if you join the conversation today on social media as well. Follow us on Facebook and on Twitter, and you can use the hashtag Ubuntu Symposium or hashtag Symposio Ubuntu in Spanish. So yeah, you're very welcome to today's session, Building and Engaging Young Leaders. My name's Sinead Nolan. I'm the Programme Officer at the MenEngage Global Secretariat, and I coordinate our work on youth leadership and engagement. And today I'm going to be co-moderating the session with Hassan Juma, who is the Senior Masculinities Programme Officer from Abad in Lebanon. For this session today, for the structure, it's going to be in two parts. We're going to present the strategy, one part of the strategy, then have a little bit of audience participation and a discussion from the panel of youth activists and experts on working with youth that we've invited today. And then we're going to present the next part of the strategy and have a discussion based on that. So I'd encourage you to use the chat box. You can start by letting us know your name, your country where you're joining us from, your organization, and feel free to ask questions as we go. We'll probably leave the audience questions and answers till the end, but please do write your questions as you think of them, or your thoughts, reflections, anything you want to share, and we'll share the questions with the panelists later. We're really excited today to launch our new youth strategy. It's a really exciting moment for us at MenEngage. Just to give a little bit of background into the strategy, I think since the beginning of MenEngage, I think youth engaging with young people, youth engagement, working with young men and boys from a young age has been something that's been very fundamental for MenEngage Alliance throughout. But I think this concept of youth leadership and actually having young people leading our activities and our strategies and in our governance structures is something kind of newer to MenEngage and something that maybe we haven't been so strong in historically. But over the last few years, I think there's been a growing recognition among MenEngage at the global level and also in our regional networks and among our membership of the need to move beyond just engaging with young people as part of programs and projects, but to really have young people leading all of our initiatives. There's been a recognition of what young people can bring to movements and networks like MenEngage, and also a recognition of the need to connect with and to be accountable to youth movements, so young feminist movements and the other youth movements around the world today. So this is kind of what we're aiming to strengthen with this strategy. Over the last 3 or 4 years, I think now, we've been convening the MenEngage Alliance Youth Reference Group, which is brings together youth activists and experts on working with youth from across our regional networks. So we've been convening and doing joint activities for the last few years, participating in advocacy fora like CSW, doing panels, webinars, collaborating on the youth committee for this symposium. But what we wanted to do with the strategy is really kind of make this engagement with young leaders more systematic, more strategic, to integrate youth leadership and engagement throughout all of the pillars that we do. So it's not a standalone thing, but something that runs throughout our whole work. So what we did last year in 2020, we set upon a process to develop this new youth strategy. We worked with an external consultant, Linda Saleh from FemJust, and we went through, she led us through a very participatory process, primarily with the Youth Reference Group. I think they were the main leaders of developing the strategy, but also with the regional coordinators and the MenEngage Global Secretariat team to develop this strategy together. The strategy outlines a set of principles and values that guide us in our work on youth leadership and engagement, and also some concrete goals and strategies for our work over the next 4 years from 2021 to 2024. The strategy, it really, because it's our first strategy of this sort on youth leadership, it really kind of lays out some of the very foundational steps that we need to do over the coming years in order to strengthen this work, like putting the right processes in place, the right kind of mechanisms, the right partnerships that we need to build, building the right capacities both among the Youth Reference Group itself and the rest of the Alliance in order to be able to strengthen this work going forward. And it's available in English, Spanish, and French, as you can see here. I'll put the link in the chat box now as well, so you can all access it. So that's a little bit of background. Now I'm going to pass you over to Hassan, who is going to first present the principles and values from the strategy. Hassan, over to you.
Thanks, Sinead. So hello, everyone. First of all, let me share. I just have the link of the English version. Sinead will share the in other languages. So hello, everyone. Starting with the principle of values that we were working on when we were developing the youth strategy. First of all, let's start with youth leadership. So we believe that that youth are experts, and their experience are the source of their knowledge and our knowledge, for sure. Thus, we must be equal partners in all decision making. Then going to transforming patriarchal masculinity. So we're committing to acting to end violence against women, especially men's violence. So we strive to challenge the discriminatory and unequal power relations and harmful gender norms and stereotypes that perpetuate violence. We go to youth participation. So we believe that young generation must be engaged as civil society actors, which we mean by this access to resources, networks, and getting opportunities in programming. And all of this aims to transform patriarchal masculinities and create socially and gender just societies. Then going to the allyship and accountability. So we're committed to gender justice and to advocate in support to the progressive agendas of women's rights, feminisms, climate change, LGBTQIA, and other social justice groups and movements. So throughout the work, we center those most affected by gender inequality and violence. Over to the next slide, please. Okay, so then we go to collaboration. So we aim in our work to strengthen intergenerational partnership, whether it's with other young people, whether it's with networks, whether it's with organizations in the regional, national, and international levels. So we believe that our work will be strengthened when we have this partnership all together. Going to the human rights, our commitment to gender and social justice is informed by respect to the human rights of all people and the recognition that these rights are absolute. And going to the last principle and value, which is inclusivity. So we are an inclusive community, so we're strengthened by the participation of young people, whether boys or girls, men and women, and people of all genders, and as well as the participation of people of all sexual orientations, ethnicities, abilities, and any other personal or social identities that contribute to their exclusion or marginalization. So this, let's go now to, we have like one question on Mentimeter. So please, if you can go on menti.com and enter this code. So when we go to Mentimeter, we found a question where, are there any other principles or values we should consider in the implementation of the strategy? So is there any other principle or values that you can think of in order to consider while implementing the strategy? Oh, so so we skipped one question. So the first question was, which principle or value is most relevant to you and your work?
It doesn't look like a lot of people have been able to access Mentimeter. Are people having difficulties accessing the site? If that's the case, we can move on. Oh, we're having some people join now. Maybe we'll just give it one more minute or two.
So until now, we have 4 on youth leadership, 2 on youth participation, 4 on transforming patriarchal masculinities. The numbers are increasing. 3 on youth participation, 2 intersectionality, 1 human rights, and 1 on inclusivity.
I think we can move on to the second one, Hassan.
Yes. So are there any other principles or values we should consider in the implementation of the strategy? So we had accountability can be rethought of as accountability with love. We have youth participation. We have meaningful participation, human rights, participation of LGBTQIA. We also have important to ensure young people are provided with the support, resource, and capacity they may need to fully participate in MenEngage Alliance. Sure. Youth safety, redefining what it means to be an organizer, which voices must be centered, manage heteronormativity, advocacy, nothing about us without us, providing support to youth leaders, advocacy. So thank you for these inputs. Of course, we'll take all of this into consideration. So providing youth-led and youth-serving organizations with flexible funding other than highly competitive grants young people cannot access, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. Again, also explicit support to LGBTQI people, using technology for gender justice. Okay, thank you all for your answers. As I said before, we will take it into consideration. Thank you for answering. So now, following the following the principles and values, let me first welcome our speakers in this panel. So we have Marcus Kesson, Institute for Gender and Development Studies from the University of West Indies. We have Sagar Sachdeva, WP Foundation India. We have Pamela Saavedra Castro, Foundation Cultura Salud Chile. And we have, and Urbania is with us, right?
No, she hasn't been able to join us at the moment. She's having some internet connection difficulties, so we may not get to hear from Urbania today, unfortunately.
Okay, so thank you all and welcome welcome on this panel. So first of all, we have some questions on that we would like to get your answers on when it comes to the values and principles. So first of all, starting with Sagar. So the foundation of this strategy is a strong belief in and a commitment to youth leadership. What does this mean for you and your work? Over to you, Sagar.
Hi everyone, thanks Hassan for that question and the introduction. I'll give a few comments on youth leadership and participation, and I think after that would be nice if we can have a discussion around this with the other colleagues here. But when we speak of youth participation in leadership, what we generally hear a lot about is how every decision making needs to have youth consultations, any policy that is being made, were the young people consulted or not before that. And I think it's very important to do that. But oftentimes we see that it usually stops there, and a lot of leadership stops being accountable to the young people who were consulted. And that's where I enter the conversation on youth leadership, that to make leadership more accountable, to make leadership more representative of the needs of young people, it is very important that young people are in positions where they're directly making decisions about their own lives, or any policy, any implementation, or even program designs that are being designed that impact their lives. And what it does is that it not only builds capacities of young people to be able to take their own decisions, it also then amplifies into affecting many other young people who are not directly in those positions of leadership to actually have many positive outcomes in their own lives. So in that sense, I think this would be one of the most important principles that we have in this strategy, given the, and I'll go towards just being a little bit specific about how this would be relevant to work on masculinities, work with young men and boys, and that would be that a lot of times when we look at the experiences of young men and boys from a feminist lens, from the lens of gender equality, we do see experiences a lot of violence being perpetrated and a lot of violence being perpetrated upon given young men's experiences of marginalizations along other identities other than gender. So in those in those spheres of work, I do feel all interventions that we design as people who work with men and boys, as people who work with policies that impact young people, we need to work towards some kind of capacity building of young people to access those positions where decisions are being taken, as well as take informed decisions with the right knowledge and skills that they have. And I think what would be the way to do it, we'll get to later in this conversation. But just would maybe close these comments with just saying that we need to identify within a democratic model of what youth leadership looks like, the different levels at which we want to see youth leadership happening. As I said, that when we talk about policies and laws that affect different kinds of outcomes, especially SRHR outcomes that YP Foundation works with, or now we see intersections of climate justice coming in, how that impacts young people a lot, and that is why we see a lot of emerging youth leadership coming. So we need to see that at that level. I also feel that that has to reflect at other many levels of the lives of young people. So do we see this? We see the struggle of young people being able to make decisions in their personal lives when it comes to the family and the community they live in. So have we built capacities within communities where young people are enabled to take those decisions within their families about how their lives will play out? And similarly, do we within development work have frameworks where we can ensure right now whether the programs we are designing, the programs we are researching, and the programs we're implementing are led by young people? So I think these are the first few questions and the levels I would identify when I'm thinking youth leadership as a value in this strategy.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that, Sagar. Actually, you're totally right when it comes to reach a point where youth can take the decisions or can take part in policy designs, program designs, policy development. I guess it's very important also to make sure that all these youth generation their capacities are raised. And on the national and even on the international levels, when it comes to the context they are working in, or the resources that they should have access to. So thank you, Sagar, for your answer. So going to Marcus now. So one of the principles that is central to this strategy, as well as everything, is MenEngage is so the main strategy that MenEngage is trying to do is to have allyship and accountability. So how can the Alliance be better allies to youth movements around the world?
Well, first of all, by reflecting on some of the youth work that I have experienced in the region, we have campaigns from the Ignite, which is a political gender justice group at university that does tremendous work around something called Chalk Back, which is talking about street harassment, all organized by young people on the campus. I've also seen the Hewing Law School Human Rights Committee, which are young, budding attorneys take up issues of gender justice, migration, child sexual abuse. We've also seen queer and LGBT groups coming out of the campus as well, like Pride TT, and then also off-campus organizations like Life in Leggings, FemNet, all gender justice organizations, creating avenues and non-traditional ways of participation in cultural shift, gender justice work. And I think what I've learned from just being exposed from these organizations is, one, allyship. We have to consider one, young people as powerful agents of social change. One, absolutely. I mean, we also have to consider that young people allow for us and allow for society, policymakers, adults to understand contemporary spaces. One cannot move and build policy, as someone said earlier. We can't be making policy without their input, given the context in which young people exist in. Also, I mean, we have to consider that there's truth and power, that there's power in action. There's, one of the campaigns here as well in Trinidad, and that going back again to on-campus youth movement is that one, young people and young people's spaces become a microcosm of the everyday society that young people live in, right? It tells us about race, class, ethnicity, the gender biases, their access to resources. Young people's spaces allows for us to understand the problems that young people face and that society faces. Young people and young people movements are also empirical data for us to understand what and how society functions, whether we are repeating, perpetuating the same social problems. Are there nuances to these problems, especially the way in which young people either continue it, perpetuate it, or challenge it, or we see change, which is how we learn, right? Through the classrooms, we see whether or not gender stereotypes still exist, how they exist, the language that comes with it. As we talk about allyship, I think it's important for us to consider any agency that is willing to do any kind of gender justice work, feminist work. What does inclusion and recognition of these voices look like? I think that is key in allyship. I think representation as well, which we know is quite valuable, because rural young people versus urbanized young people versus young people who have access to university and tertiary education versus those who access vocational training, those multiple spaces needs to be represented in the decision making at all levels and with all social problems. And I think it's also important for us to consider talk and power in conversation. What do we as organizations, established organizations, how are we facilitating the conversation with young people? How are we involving them in the conversation? And what do we do with that information? Are we just having youth arms of established organizations for tokenism purposes? Is it because funders are asking for young people? What does that information, what does that youth body, youth inclusion really look like? And it has to start with the conversation and what we do with that conversation. Because, I've seen in my own experience sitting down at state level meetings, building policy, even NGOs that have all good intentions do have youth arms, but are our opinions still seen as unfocused, idealistic? I think we have to ask ourselves, what does allyship look like when we're engaging young people?
And also how inclusivity has a strong relation with allyship, right? This is something also to take into consideration. So it's good how we can in order to create this allyship to start bodying with groups and organizations from different backgrounds or different scope of work in order to reach or to address the social change or any gender biases or any problems related to gender inequalities and any gaps that are within the society or the communities in general. So thank you, Marcus. over to you, Pamela. So my question is about the intergenerational partnership. So we say that it's part of the principle and it's a buzzword in our field at the moment. What does this idea mean to you, and how can MenEngage Alliance foster intergenerational partnership?
Sí, muchas gracias. Muchas gracias, Hassan, por la invitación, Ginette también. Voy a estar hablando en español para hacerle justicia a mis compañeros de Latinoamérica. La colaboración intergeneracional a mí me parece que es fundamental para empezar a pensar justamente en ese concepto, colaboración, que muchas veces no es entendido o no es practicado como una colaboración como tal, sino que es como una ayuda o como lo que decía Marcos, que es como tener un lugar para los jóvenes, pero sin una real participación, sin tomar en cuenta muchas veces lo que se está planteando desde las voces jóvenes. Por ejemplo, acá en Latinoamérica, en Chile en particular, que es mi país, las generaciones jóvenes son las que están planteando los grandes temas y las grandes transformaciones sociales. El año antes pasado, el 2019, cuando hubo la revuelta de octubre acá en Chile, y bueno, lo que está pasando ahora en Colombia, son los jóvenes, los y las jóvenes, quienes están llevando adelante las revueltas. Porque finalmente son esta generación que ya no tiene tanto miedo de enfrentar a la autoridad, no hay un miedo de el qué dirán o qué sé yo, que sí lo pueden haber tenido generaciones anteriores. Por ejemplo, acá en Chile, debido a las múltiples dictaduras militares de Latinoamérica, existe ese miedo en las generaciones más grandes. Pero los jóvenes están fuera de esta idea del miedo como tal y sí tienen muchas ganas de cambiar la sociedad y los patrones sociales y los constructos sociales. Ellos son los que están llevando adelante esta bandera de lucha y no solamente lo hacen por ellos, y eso es lo más interesante. Cuando acá se les preguntaba a los jóvenes ¿por qué tú estás haciendo esto? Era para que mi familia, mis papás, mis abuelos tengan una mejor vida. Que si yo decido tener hijos, mis hijos tengan una mejor vida. Entonces, finalmente, esta idea de colaboración intergeneracional es justamente eso. Es cómo pensamos una idea de sociedad horizontal, en la que las jerarquías sociales no funcionen como tal en la transformación, porque al final cuando empezamos a generar quiénes son voces más válidas que otras por temas como la edad, se va perdiendo un poco la idea de transformación social. O sea, creo que nosotros hemos avanzado un montón en ya ver que la voz femenina o la voz de las disidencias es válida, pero todavía tenemos estos otros resabios patriarcales en las que nos dicen que las voces no adultas no son válidas. Entonces, ¿por qué no generamos una forma de colaboración en la que todas las voces sean válidas, todas pueden aportar desde su punto de vista? Porque al final, la voz adulta, claro, tiene cierta experiencia, tiene ciertos conocimientos, pero la voz joven, al igual, tiene conocimientos y tiene experiencias distintas. Y tiene una forma de ver la vida y la sociedad que es distinta a la voz adulta. Porque la voz adulta puede ser, y aquí puedo estar generalizando, pero puede ser que esté ya muy metida, muy dentro de la estructura. Y la voz joven nos está invitando a pensar una sociedad fuera de este encasillamiento. Entonces, finalmente, la colaboración intergeneracional es muy importante. Y ahí yo quiero ir contra todos los críticos de las juventudes que empiezan a decir que los que abogamos por por los liderazgos juveniles solo estamos pensando en los jóvenes y que decimos que los viejos no tienen la razón. No es así, yo solo estoy invitando a escucharnos. Y finalmente, la experiencia que nos pueden entregar los adultos y la experiencia que nos pueden entregar los jóvenes, hay que mirarlas como una horizontalidad, como un compartir, como un compartir de experiencias que nos sirve un montón. Por ejemplo, en la Alianza MenEngage, los jóvenes vienen trayendo una idea, acciones, qué sé yo, pero los adultos que están en MenEngage ya tienen un poco el establecimiento de la alianza, tienen ciertas conexiones, saben quizás un poco más como, por ahí decían en el Mentimeter, como postular a estos grants que son terribles. Y esa experiencia sí nos lo pueden compartir, podemos ir generando capacidades juntos. Creo que eso es muy importante y creo que desde la intergeneracionalidad lo podemos abarcar. Entonces, más allá de cómo poner y perpetuar esta batalla de los viejos contra los jóvenes, es más bien cómo generar puentes comunicacionales y de acción que nos permitan avanzar juntos.
Well, thank you, Pamela. Your Spanish is really good as a start. So actually, I would like to add here a point, Pamela, and all others, is that when we started our work in the society, we used to see that old people, when we work with old people, we have to take care because they have the system, it's implanted within their brain, so we should aim not to include them a lot. But afterwards and throughout the years, when we saw how we can learn from their experience, or how we can do like learning or sharing experiences with all together, how our interventions, how our strategic planning or planning of projects on the ground, how it can be different and how it can reach a point where the success of the project can be reached much easier, and by engaging different parts and different personas from the society, whatever their background is or their position in the society is. So thank you, Pamela, for the intervention. Going back to the cigar. So Sagar, how we can ensure that intersectionality is at the core of the implementation of the strategy?
Thanks, Hassan. Before I just give a few comments around intersectionality and what that would look like in any future engagements, what I think a point that I've just missed earlier and would actually help me sort of get into this is to understand also when we speak about youth leadership and participation, we also need to highlight one point within any process, is that participation and leadership is also a right and not something that is given to young people. So when we're formulating strategies and interventions around building these capacities, it should never be in a way that that young people are being brought into a room or young people are being given space, but more in the sense of young people are taking up space that was already there, right? So with that spirit. And I do think that while I think that youth leadership already being a value in this strategy could maybe highlight that point in the future. It would be very nice to see that, since oftentimes that spirit seems to get missed. Going over to intersectionality, I think it does tie up very closely with the value of inclusivity as well, in the sense that we need right now, what we need to do is also understand marginalizations in many plural forms. So given that we try to understand privileges and marginalizations associated with identities, it is, and more research is definitely showing that it is the case that a lot of people occupy positions of privilege vis-a-vis some identities, but also feel marginalized vis-a-vis many other identities that they may be occupying in. And that specifically holds true for young men and boys that we've been working with and have been conducting some research in the past with, is that while experiences of gender leave a lot of cis straight men in many positions of power, they also, a lot of young men feel frustrated by the kind of inequalities that they experience along the lines of religion and caste and sexual orientation, and therefore have many experiences of marginalization that then that are in fact informing perpetration of violence as well. And that kind of the hierarchies that exist among men also need to be understood when we speak about intersectionality also. So in my experience of this work, I would definitely recommend that in any future intervention that we're trying to build right now, what we're trying to do is think about center young men's experiences in talking about masculinities and diversify the notion of masculinity, since we are already talking about challenging patriarchal masculinities. One way to do that is to diversify it, to understand masculinities as positions where privileges and vulnerabilities intersect and interact with each other. And as an example, I would also, and this is something that we're now trying to do in our work, is also just expand the definition of masculinities itself. A lot of times, because the onus is to also make gender positive, equality positive outcomes for young men and boys as well. Also diversify the definition of masculinities beyond just cis straight men, and try to understand masculinities in the context of very diverse experience of masculine identifying people. And that would include a lot of gender non-conforming people, gender non-binary people, trans masculine people, anybody who identifies with masculinities or experiences associated with it, to create a dialogue which will bring people of many different kinds of masculinities into the same room. And if we can create platforms like these within very local, smaller interventions to larger interventions, up to the kind of platform that this alliance is also holding, those conversations also have potential to challenge the patriarchal notions of masculinities, which is very gender binary, very associated with experiences of privilege along many other identities. And I think that intersection of patriarchy with its, so in South Asian context, with its nexus of religion and caste and ability and sexuality, all of those things start getting challenged when we make masculinities a little more intersectional whenever we talk about it.
Exactly. Yeah, it's really important for organization or general population, the communities, to understand what does masculinity mean. Because when you go and ask what does it mean to be a man in your community, there you can hear like billions of answers from different places, like having muscles, having many sexual relationships. So the context and the knowledge of knowing what does a man mean is still negotiable and needs a lot of work within the communities that we're working with. So ending the part of, thank you, Sagar, ending the part of values and principles. So a question to all the speakers, or do you want to add anything, or do you have any intervention on further interventions?
Yo solo quisiera estar muy de acuerdo con lo que acaba de decir Sagar, de que al expander el concepto de masculinidad, podemos ver que no existe esa real masculinidad hegemónica tan estructurada y que muchos jóvenes están tratando de llegar por vías violentas. Esa masculinidad tan arquetípica, tan utópica, no existe como tal. Es una ilusión, y lo peligroso de esa ilusión es que se está tratando de llegar a ella de una manera violenta. Entonces, cuando nosotros trabajamos con jóvenes, mostrándole un abanico de cómo se puede ser hombre y que todas esas formas son válidas, creo que es un gran punto para la humanidad. Como que nos anotamos un gran avance para la humanidad. Solo eso. Muchas gracias.
Indeed, Pamela. Thank you for elaborating on this. So any other thought? Okay, thank you all. Going back to Sinead, is there any question that you need to answer following up on the chat box?
Not yet, but we encourage everyone to please ask your questions to the panelists in the chat box, and we'll try to get to them. One question that did come up in the chat box was about the target age for youth in the strategy. And that's something that we kind of go back and forth with and struggle quite a lot about what age we're actually talking about here. So maybe I could ask the panelists first if they have any reflections on that question.
I mean, for me, youth is recognized in Trinidad as 29. I think we should consider being strategic as well as not being ageist at the same time. I think we have to really be cautious about that, because like the UN, they acknowledge youth up to 40. So I think how does that work if we're trying to build alliances with international bodies? I think we have to be a little strategic and maximize its opportunities, as well as to really consider. I mean, we have to be as minimalist as possible as well. I mean, and that meaning youth in terms of numbers, and as you know, as youthful as we want to go. I think it has to be something that we thought out strategically, culturally, and how we can make the greater impact. I mean, that's my recommendation for thinking about age.
Yeah, thanks, Marcus. I think we don't have it defined in the strategy, but we generally think of 35 because I think some definitions go up to 35. But I think it's important to kind of to think about kind of two different things. I think we're all working with young people in the communities, and we want to work with young people on gender stereotypes and gender norms from a very young age. At the same time, though, in terms of integrating young activists and young leaders within the work of MenEngage, a lot of them are kind of more at the upper age of that spectrum, but they in turn are the ones that are connected to younger people in their communities. And I think we should strive as part of the strategy to try and involve, you know, teenagers, adolescents, younger people as much as possible. Yeah, thanks for that question.
Any other thought?
We have a couple of questions in the chat box now. What support is available for youth-led and youth-serving organizations? That's from Abbas. We have another question. How does the strategy address power relations within the larger group called youth? How do you ensure inclusivity, and what are the practical steps that lead to inclusivity? That's from Savita. And from Jan, added to that question, how can exclusion of non-English youth from rural areas be prevented? That's a lot of questions, but if anybody wants to tackle those on the panel, you're very welcome to.
I'll take the question on power, and I really want to build on the foundation that Saga has talked about in terms of the hierarchies of masculinity. I think also another kind of power dynamic that we have to consider is adultism. I think adultism is one of the biggest systemic, like other isms, one of the biggest systemic barriers to how young people are included, valued, respected, and engaged in everyday life and social issues. I think it also limits access. So for example, in queer work, there's something called queer respectability, meaning that you can only engage your queer identity, your queer issues, if you present yourself in a particular kind of way, right? Gay men are expected to, okay, be gay, but also to be as masculine presenting as possible. And we see that devaluing when it comes to trans women, trans men, so-called feminized men. And I think we have to challenge adultism, and because adultism challenges youth authenticity. It tells you that you can only be included if you present to us as adults in these particular kinds of ways, and it also limits the voices and the experiences. So I think it, on a foundational level, on a philosophical level, we have to consider the power dynamic between adult and young people, and whose voices are valued. And I think, to me, that is where a lot of the power struggle with youth work, youth movement, youth voices, youth inclusion comes from.
Sí, estoy súper de acuerdo con lo que dice Marcos. Creo que el adultocentrismo es uno de los ismos que todavía quedan y que no se ven tan peligrosos como otros ismos, pero que generan mucho daño. Estoy pensando en la pregunta de Jan sobre la exclusión de los non-English speakers. Creo que ahí hay que tener muy en cuenta la interseccionalidad, pero también el concepto de decolonización, porque al final tenemos que, tal como estamos tratando de pensar en transformar las normas de género, tenemos que tener en cuenta que las normas de género no son iguales en todo el mundo y que países tercermundistas como Latinoamérica y todo lo que no sea Europa y Estados Unidos, básicamente, queda marginalizado y queda como algo, estoy pensando en la cultura del macho acá en Latinoamérica, que es muy heteronormativa, muy violenta y muy adulta. Pensando en los maras en Centroamérica, donde se toma niños y se los forma como paramilitares, como ejércitos, finalmente, como ejércitos civiles. Entonces ahí es poner e imponer la cultura macho, la cultura adultocéntrica, es generar mini adultos en niños, mini adultos violentos. Entonces creo que es súper importante ahí tener en cuenta que la masculinidad hegemónica, la masculinidad adulta, no es igual en todo el mundo. Y con el tema de la globalización y las migraciones, va generando guetos. Porque cuando un migrante llega a un país en donde esta cultura no es lo recurrente, se genera marginalización y se genera como esta idea de que está mal, de que, claro, porque son la cultura macho, entonces, bueno, ellos son así, entonces no se trabaja con ellos desde su propia cultura y además así también no se, no se encuentra sentido cuando uno trabaja con poblaciones en las que uno no logra generar sentido a lo que uno está trabajando, es porque uno no está llegando a esa población finalmente. Entonces creo que pensar desde la interseccionalidad, pero también desde lo decolonial, es muy importante para llegar a poblaciones excluidas y marginalizadas, porque al final, si estamos hablando de adultocentrismo y de patriarcado, la cultura occidental es el ejemplo perfecto de lo patriarcal y de lo adulto. Entonces, bueno, eso creo que tenemos que tener bien en cuenta cómo empezar a trabajar desde distintos lentes, porque si no es muy difícil.
Great. I think we need to move on because of time, but I think some of those questions about the more concrete implementation of the strategy we'll come to in the next part. So I think let's move on and present the goals and strategies. If I can have the slides up again, please. Thanks to all the panelists. We'll come back to you shortly. The strategy outlines 5 different goals and a number of strategies underneath those to help us achieve those goals. Goal 1 is about centering young people in all their diversity. So this is about really ensuring that young people's voices and perspectives and experiences are at the center of our work as MenEngage Alliance to promote gender justice. So part of this is about including that young people are included within our governance structures at all levels of the Alliance. So establishing kind of frameworks and processes for including people and moving towards a model of more power sharing among young people. So we want to ensure that diverse groups or diverse young people have decision-making power at all stages of our programming and our advocacy work. So part of this will involve for example, establishing a membership model for the Youth Reference Group and strengthening that as the core anchor for the youth work. Another part of this will be reviewing our processes and practices that may be preventing the meaningful participation of young people. That's a really key step, I think, for the first year of the strategy. And to share the strategy and ways of working with the wider membership. So moving on to goal 2. Goal 2 is about empowering young people, making sure that they have the skills, the knowledge, and the opportunities they need to lead and participate in all the aspects of MenEngage Alliance's work. So part of this is providing young people with support to access the capacity and tools that they need to develop personally and professionally. So for example, facilitating capacity strengthening opportunities to learn about feminism, intersectional approaches with an anti-racist lens, and also more practical skills to strengthen young people's confidence and ability to participate in the work of the Alliance. And it's about creating opportunities, identifying opportunities rather, to make these skills, capacities, and knowledge actionable. So for creating opportunities for young people to lead within the Alliance. For example, leading on campaigns and programming to advance our mission and vision. Another part of this is strengthening knowledge and support for youth leadership and meaningful youth participation. So this is really about not just strengthening the capacities of young people within the Alliance, but strengthening the capacities of all of us within the Alliance to support youth leadership, youth participation, to support youth adult partnerships. Part of this will also be to develop a fundraising strategy so we can implement this strategy properly. And providing ongoing support to our regional and country network members to strengthen this work at their levels. And it's about creating opportunities for intergenerational skills and knowledge sharing at all levels. So this is, for example, creating communication pathways and ways of sharing knowledge about youth leadership and engagement, about capturing best practices of working with young people and sharing these, and kind of creating a kind of a virtual hub or platform that will facilitate this interaction and create spaces for cross-regional and intergenerational learning. That's it. Over to you, Hassan, for goal 3.
So, goal 3, build and strengthen community. And this is basically by the Youth Reference Group, in which we facilitate connection between young members at the country, region, and the global level to support movement building efforts, knowing that the Youth Reference Group contain or have individuals from different regions across the country. Whether these people can be from organizations, they can be part of MenEngage Alliance or MenEngage networks within all the region. Actually, the Youth Reference Group also built the trust and developed partnership with politically aligned youth organizations and networks. And usually they exchange knowledge, analysis, and tactics across the regions and generation of activities and advocates. So even in our rotational calls, we always share what do we have, what news we have, what we did, what was the activities in terms of working with youth was achieved or was done in the past duration. So we always keep ourselves in the momentum of knowing what's going on or sharing our activities or our main work or scope of work. Next slide, please. Okay, go for accountable advocacy and allyship. Also, the Youth Reference Group builds and practices solidarity and accountability for feminist advocacy agendas for gender equality and social justice, in which it mobilizes men and boys to engage in gender transformative practices and advocates for social and gender justice and promote transforming patriarchal masculinities. And this is also this is mainly by engaging men and boys in order to know what does masculinity mean, what are the main programs that can be achieved or can be implemented when it comes to engaging men, but having the main objective of advocating for women's rights and ending violence against women in the societies. Moving to the next one. So the goal 5 is cross-cutting between all the 5 goals, and it's about accountability. So usually it's accountability to the most affected by gender inequalities and violence and to one another.
Great, thanks, Hassan. So that's the strategy in its entirety. Now we're going to have a space for another bit of audience participation. We'd love to hear some of your thoughts on the strategy now that you've heard the whole thing presented. So again, if you can go to Mentimeter, so menti.com, and enter the code there. I'll give everyone a couple of minutes to access it again.
And if you can open it here.
So for this one, it's really just a broad question. So in 1, 2, I think you can put 3 words in a few words, kind of what are your overall impressions of the strategy? And I think you can also add in, you can add up to 3 answers. So feel free to share a few thoughts. Is it ambitious? Is it not ambitious enough? Anything that comes to mind, it would be really great to hear some of your feedback. Is it confusing? Is it understandable? Whatever you think. Okay. Extensive, thought-provoking, brilliant. Great words so far. Comprehensive, accessible language. Yeah, that's really important. We tried to achieve that. Any other thoughts? Okay. Does not look new. Okay, interesting. Yeah. Focused. Good one. Just wait another 30 seconds or so to see if anyone else wants to input their thoughts. Okay, maybe that's it for now. Thanks for sharing. Oh, we have a few more here. Who determines meaningful youth participation? Yeah, very good question. I think that will be up to the Youth Reference Group to assess as we continue to monitor the strategy. Respect for culture, interesting. Interesting and necessary, very much so. Timely. Okay, the most common word was comprehensive, which is what we were aiming for, but some great thoughts in there that we'll dig into further. Thank you. Okay, so coming back to the panel. One second. Okay, so as you all saw, goal 1 is about centering young people in the Alliance's governance structures. So I wanted to ask you, Pamela, from your experience of working in your regional network in Latin America, what do you think are some of the challenges that you face in this, and what are some of the things we should keep in mind? Or sorry, what are some of the ways that we can address some of these challenges?
Sí, creo que los mayores desafíos, me hace sentido lo que menciona acá en el Mentimeter, tiene que ver con que no parece nuevo, con que ya hemos hecho muchas, o se han hecho, no nosotros, pero ya se han hecho muchos intentos, pero el problema, creo yo, que es que todos esos intentos justamente no son desde y para los jóvenes, sino que son desde el mundo adulto, tratando de incluir, y desde esa manera de inclusión no comprensiva, sino que de inclusión como ayuda a los jóvenes. Entonces, creo yo que una de las mayores dificultades que hemos tenido, tanto regionalmente, es justamente los temas de lenguaje, cómo llegar a los jóvenes, porque querámoslo o no, la alianza MenEngage utiliza un lenguaje más bien desde las políticas públicas y más académico, cosa que no parece llamar la atención de los jóvenes, parece como algo lejano, parece como algo bastante condescendiente. Entonces creo que los mayores desafíos es justamente tratar de presentarlo o o pensarlo como algo nuevo, como otra forma de abordar la participación juvenil. Y creo que para eso es muy importante, y creo que nosotros tuvimos una mini luz, una mini experiencia con el programa de SRHR, que para todos que estuvimos implementando el año pasado, donde generamos un grupo motor de jóvenes de Latinoamérica. Gracias a la pandemia pudimos juntarnos todos vía virtual, cosa que no era posible muchas veces de otras maneras. Y se generó un grupo en el que los jóvenes pudieron hablar de sus experiencias muy libremente, de sus experiencias de salud sexual y reproductiva muy libremente, porque sentían que ellos tienen el poder o las riendas de este grupo. Y eso creo que es fundamental para iniciar trabajo con jóvenes, dar esa libertad de sentirse que lo son, sentirse actores sociales. Creo que es muy importante ver a la juventud como actor social. Como les decía, acá en Chile, y ahora lo que está pasando en Latinoamérica y en Colombia, sobre todo, que un gran abrazo para los compañeros colombianos, es la juventud la que pone el cuerpo. Finalmente, cuando vemos los muertos de las revueltas son jóvenes. Entonces no podemos seguir poniendo a los jóvenes como carnada, como carne de cañón, y no darles el estatus de actor social. Me parece que es muy injusto y me parece que solo mantiene las estructuras de poder, y creo que desde ahí, o sea, como un gran primer paso, creo yo, que es posicionar a la juventud como actor social y desde ahí dar esa voz necesaria para poder hacer puentes con otras organizaciones. Entonces, sí, creo que tenemos muchos desafíos y creo que algunas maneras de abordarlo tienen que ver con la participación, pero comprensiva, importante, meaningful, como ahí decían. Creo que es bien importante eso. Y además dejar que se planteen agendas propias. Creo que eso también hemos fallado en eso, en imponer agendas.
Great, thanks, Pamela. So many good points there about language accessibility, about movement building, which is really important in this. Yeah, and so many rich experiences coming from your experience in Latin America on the SRHR project. So it's a real shame that we don't have Urbenia with us today, because Urbenia is the youth chairperson for MenEngage Africa, which is a regional network that has really strong youth structures in place, and a lot of experience to share on youth leadership that can be shared with other regions. So it's a real shame that we can't hear from her today. But Marcus or Sagar, maybe do one of you want to comment on kind of this issue of including young people in governance structures of the Alliance at all levels, before we move on?
Yeah, Sinead, I could probably briefly come in and maybe add another point here. And I'd say this as one of the speakers who probably strictly speaking, I'm sorry, that's my video, probably strictly speaking wouldn't count myself as an insider proper to the Alliance, but also have engaged with the Alliance now and then quite often. Would be that I agree with Pamela that young people are at the forefront of a lot of movements, are taking up a lot of initiatives. But what also what it does is also that it puts a lot of young people at risk because of the possible backlash then they might be exposed to. And one very broad question for the MenEngage Alliance or any organization that wants to think about youth leadership is also to then discuss and sort of understand what kind of risk sharing can any collective or alliance can do with youth movements and young leaders. So we're talking, and we will probably talk more about capacity building and providing resources to different young people as change agents, as social agents. But what kind of risk sharing then are we doing with them would also be an interesting question, because of two things. One is that when we speak about leadership and decision making, there is potential backlash because young people are fighting a lot of structures that have been around for a very long time, that have people occupying a lot of positions of power who can retaliate. That is also the kind of support that needs to be facilitated for that decision making to happen. So along with confidence building comes sort of risk absorption as well. And in terms of when decisions backfire, when decisions go wrong, then what kind of support is there for young people to also do things that do not turn out the way they did? And that's the kind of resilience that I feel that a lot of established networks and alliances already have in terms of what we call resources. So I think somewhere around this conversation at some point could be inserted into what facilitated support is needed for building youth leadership. That would probably be very helpful in the future.
Great, thanks, Sagar. I think important points on kind of risk that maybe we hadn't addressed so much in the strategy, so that's really helpful. Yeah, and next I was going to ask you on goal 2, and I think you've already touched on it a lot, Sagar, but I was going to ask you around the goal 2, which centers around empowering young people and young people's capacities. What kind of capacities should we be cultivating among young people and among others in the Alliance? And kind of how can networks like MenEngage enable this kind of capacity development?
Yeah, so in terms of capacities, and for any meaningful youth participation process, I'd say knowledge and skill building would be a very obvious step, and I'm glad the strategy accounts for that. In experiences of working with gender, and speaking from the experience of YP Foundation's work on SRHR issues and comprehensive sexuality education, what we have seen is that there are many positive outcomes to see if we do knowledge building around rights of young people, as well as the discriminations that they face. Not to say that young people do not know about their experiences, but also to provide some kind of a framework to look at those experiences. So often, especially with very young people, as we're talking about different categories within young people, a lot of adolescents may not be aware of the rights they have, may not be aware of the rights they may have, but are also not reflected in the legal or constitutional framework of the country. And to have access to those rights, we start with knowledge, and then we move towards skill building on how do you access those rights. So I think a rights-based framework has worked and has proven to show that there is merit in following this kind of knowledge and skill building framework. And when we say skill building, it's not just simply about using a certain kinds of advocacy tools, certain kinds of intervention tools and designs that young people can engage with, but also co-create those tools themselves. So because as we said, young people know what they're feeling, young people know what they're going through, then can we also design the work we want to do? And what structural alliances, networks have the power to do is to actually just give that space to young people to do it, and take that chance and rest with them on seeing how that actually works out. And that kind of space would definitely lead to a lot of outcomes that would be more meaningful youth participation. So yeah, those are the two major points I'd say. And yes, as we have all been agreeing with, and a lot of people in the chats have been saying it, ensure that the resources for these also exist in terms of a lot of social capital is needed, a lot of financial resources might be needed for this. Those are the things that established organizations and networks can definitely ensure. And just as an example, in the comprehensive sexuality education work that YP Foundation has been doing, we've seen that engaging with young people to become sexuality educators, to become trainers around issues of sexuality, including issues of discrimination rights, sexuality, sexual orientation, talking about patriarchy, gender, masculinities, all of these issues in a very comprehensive way. Capacity building with young people has led to more and more young people being able to access that kind of knowledge and skills framework through young facilitators themselves. So the way we work, the way we design is that we train young people to take up these kind of interventions, these kind of campaigns, and use all of these tools in a way that they feel most comfortable with the communities that they are interacting with. And that leads to a many-fold impact that way as well, and reaches out to many more young people that we would possibly not even be talking to directly. So those are some of the advantages also of doing this kind of capacity building work.
Great, thank you. And Marcus, from your experience, what do you think are some of the lessons learned from building capacities among young people, and how can MenEngage facilitate this kind of capacity building?
Great. So from where I kind of position myself on campus, I think including youth work, minority youth, and multiple experiences in a curriculum becomes so helpful. I've seen how young people have taken courses around gender, around masculinities, around feminism, and have been given the opportunity to reflect historically how those become problems, how they become problems in multiple ways, looking at theories and concepts, and then finding solutions in their own given right. So I think ensuring that we include youth issues, and just in my own experience in the Caribbean region, youth and gender is one of the least theorized or written about work, at least that I have been exposed to. I have not seen a lot of work around adolescent masculinities in the region, especially in my own work where I was looking at Indo-Caribbean male. I probably came across one or two from the same scholar who spoke about adolescent Indo boys in the region. So I think advocating for work to be done and including it in a curriculum becomes a very vital, impactful way of looking at it systematically, including it into systems, which is the curriculum and the academic system, and formalizing in a way that doesn't become so formal that no one else has access to it, if you know what I mean. But it has to be considered as well as a integrated and an important element of the learning system, just because the school system is where a lot of young people exist, and we have to see how best we could facilitate the learning around, as Saga said, their own rights, their own experiences, and give them the tools and skills to put that out there, and to support all spaces that young people exist. I think another thing too, the fact that we are an organization, MenEngage, that is grounded in accountability, is that we could hold the organization accountable for not allowing non-formal, non-organized youth bodies to be part of it and include their voices. Like, that's my experience with like the UN bodies and international bodies. If your structure doesn't meet their requirements, you are not considered eligible for funds, for your opinion, etc. And I think we have to be able to hold MenEngage as an organization, as a kind of a framework for how we include young people. And I think another way for us to ensure young people's capacity as well as they're included is to ensure that we have a succession plan. Now, a succession plan is more complicated, but I think if we speak about succession planning, young people are given the opportunity to see themselves in a bigger picture, rather than just young people with issues and contributing, but contributing in a more formalized system. So I think it's something to think through about what a succession planning could mean for young generations, for intergenerational learning, intellectual property of the organization. How do we maintain that? Which I see a lot in the region. I mean, working with Kariman, working in women's organization in the region, succession planning fails young people, fails the movement, the work that we want to do, because it's lost with the older heads who wants to hold on to power and the resources and the history of the work done. I've been part of agencies that have been in existence for 30 years, but I only know what exists based on how many years I've been there. So if I've been with an agency for 10 years, I only know what happens within that 10 years and not so much the history, the culture, the people, the formation. In that kind of inclusive, I want you to understand where we come from so that you could have a plan in where we're going with your own personalized identity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So those are just things to consider as well.
Great, thanks. Really interesting points on capacity building. I think we have to be so careful to, on one hand, really provide capacity building opportunities for our members, but avoid a very top-down prescriptive approach and make sure that young people, that these opportunities are relevant and that young people are leading their own opportunities for capacity building. I think that's so important. And in terms of succession planning, I think great points raised by Marcus. At the same time, kind of moving away from this idea that we want young people to be involved in MenEngage so they can be the next generation of leaders, because we want them to be leaders now as well, and kind of balance those two things and really invite them in as leaders now for the things that they can bring to the Alliance. Pamela, I see you nodding away there. Did you want to add anything about capacity building?
Sí, solamente, bueno, estaba escuchando muy de cerca lo que decía Marcus y creo que estoy muy de acuerdo con el tema de la planificación y creo que también uno de nuestros errores, como decía antes, ha sido imponer agendas. Acá, por ejemplo, las asambleas de varones antipatriarcales han funcionado muy bien justamente porque son espacios de conversación entre varones muy en sus términos. Entonces, han generado ese espacio necesario entre varones para hablar desde la transformación interna, pero que ya se ha transformado en proponer agendas que ya no van necesariamente al alero en el sentido de estar como con mucho miedo del movimiento feminista, porque también las feministas están bastante aburridas de estar enseñándoles todo el tiempo a los varones qué tienen que hacer. Entonces creo que estos espacios de conversación y de interpelación y de conversar con otros varones similares, pero a la vez muy distintos, porque volvemos de nuevo al abanico de masculinidades que existen. Desde estos espacios horizontales genera nuevas agendas y se propone desde ahí. Entonces creo que desde el capacity building es importantísimo también dar esos espacios también de reflexión personal. Creo que el trabajo personal es muy importante para poder trabajar hacia afuera. Creo que una no se logra sin la otra, porque si solo trabajamos hacia afuera, volvemos a caer en ciertas como cosas top-down que no le hacen bien al movimiento, porque solo repetimos discursos aprendidos sin que nos hagan sentido. Y si solo trabajamos internamente y nos quedamos en esta idea como de solo para nosotros, no logramos hacer esa conexión con el movimiento social, que es muy importante, y al final queda un poco, por decirlo de alguna forma, muy egoísta, de solo yo cambio para mis cercanos y para mí, pero que el resto se joda, por decirlo de alguna forma. Entonces creo que una sin la otra no funciona. Creo que tiene que ser trabajo interno y externo, así como bien de la mano.
Yeah, such an important point. Thank you, Pamela. And now looking at the goal 3, which is more about kind of strengthening a sense of community within the Alliance and strengthening the Youth Reference Group. Pamela, you've been a long-standing member of the Youth Reference Group. So I was wondering, could you share some reflections on how you think the group can be strengthened going forward to really support the implementation of this strategy?
Sí, ha sido una experiencia ese grupo de Youth Reference Group. Creo que ha sido un gran espacio para poder compartir experiencias y conocimientos. Creo que eso también ha sido bien importante con otras regiones. Como decía, uno como que tiende a no visualizar que en otras partes del mundo, si bien hay similaridades, hay también muchas diferencias, similitudes, perdón, hay muchas diferencias. Y hay mucho trabajo que nosotros no necesariamente estamos al tanto. O sea, por ejemplo, para nosotros en Latinoamérica, todo lo que hace África o lo que hacen en el sudeste asiático o en el mismo Caribe es un montón. O sea, lo que hacen para nosotros es genial. Tienen una organización que nosotros todavía estamos pensando cómo llevarla a cabo. Entonces creo que las experiencias de otros grupos que están más organizados es fundamental. Y ahí, claro, quizás nosotros desde Latinoamérica podemos aportar con ciertas perspectivas más teóricas o desde lo decolonial, no sé, se me ocurre. Pero ese intercambio en este grupo de referencia juvenil ha sido súper interesante porque además permite generar cierta sinergia en la red MenEngage, que creo que es fundamental porque al final terminamos trabajando muy separadamente como un poco como siendo sucursales de MenEngage y no como una alianza como tal. Y creo que lo que logra hacer este grupo de referencia es poner una base de trabajo que permite replicar de alguna forma, pero sin ser islas. Creo que genera esta base de trabajo conjunto que es bien importante. Bueno, como todo grupo tiene sus dificultades y sus desafíos de tiempo, de todo eso, pero creo que con esta estrategia y manteniendo ese impulso que ya se generó en este grupo motor, por decirlo de alguna forma, es bastante factible que se logre implementar la estrategia en nuestros distintos contextos. Y además al tener esta base, como decía, uno puede volver, rearmar, sacar y así ir haciendo un trabajo bastante más colaborativo y socializado. Creo que eso es bastante importante.
Great, thank you. And good to hear that this cross-regional sharing has been an important experience for you. I think so important across everything we do as MenEngage. Although we really want, as we move into implementing this strategy, we want to make sure that the reference group is not just a place for sharing what's happening in our own worlds, but that we really come together as a group to jointly kind of implement the strategy and act as the core of our work on this. And as you mentioned, Pamela, kind of not have it as a standalone, this is the Youth Reference Group, but really integrated throughout our advocacy work, our work on accountability, our communications work. I think that's the challenge for the years ahead. So the strategy as well mentions kind of building partnerships and connections with other youth movements and youth networks around the world, which I think is something super important for us. So Sagar, I wonder kind of what you think about what kind of partnerships we should be seeking to cultivate with other youth movements.
Right. So I think some of this discussion has come up in our conversations so far, where we have talked about the need to work with organizations or collectives which are youth-led, which work with marginalized youth, and as Marcus also had rightly pointed something out that right now is around also, and something that has come from the chat as well, is that we need to also think about groups and collectives which are not very formalized, but identify networks and movements that have organized themselves in very informal networks, work with them, and not just in the spirit of sort of providing support or providing skills and giving something, but also to create a dialogue where these movements have some space to influence the MenEngage Alliance itself, in terms of how it is governed, in terms of how it's structured, in terms of how it sees democratizing its own processes. In that way, having some kind of an exchange in these partnerships would be really important. Very specifically speaking from what we are currently trying to do in an ongoing research that we're doing around in the context of COVID, in the context of programming with boys and men in during COVID times. We're also realizing that a lot of different work happens in silos. So there's a lot of gender programming that is happening in multiple gender issues. Like GBV, it could be SRHR, it could be multiple branches within SRHR on different approaches that organizations are using. And then we have a lot of organizations that are working with men and boys on issues of education and livelihood as focus, migration within the country as focus. What we are now realizing, and this is an ongoing study that we're trying to sort of finalize, is that a need to work more cross-sectorally is coming up. What we mean by that is that, and we've long identified the need to think of a gender lens in a lot of different other issues that are being addressed in different organizations. But we're also thinking that, especially what happened in the context of COVID, was that a lot of vulnerabilities of specifically young men became worse and worse in terms of not finding any work, not finding any livelihood, not fitting into that precarious masculinity that is being taught to them as children. And that was also having a lot of impact on gender issues, such as gender-based violence, a lot of loss of mobility for girls, even beyond the certain lockdowns that we had. What we are seeing is that some kind of cross conversation needs to happen among networks and organizations who have different focal points of interventions. So organizations, for example, working on livelihoods, definitely could bring on board how they identify different marginalizations of young men, because a lot of these organizations actually are centered around the intersection of marginalized caste and religious experiences of young men in the context of livelihood. In specific, and I'm speaking specifically as an example here that we've seen in India in some geographies, and the way that kind of intersection is so central to that programming may not be so central to a masculinities intervention, which does try to reach out to people from different communities, but probably needs to also gear its content around those experiences of masculinities. So how diverse those masculinities are perhaps not as well defined as the experiences of those caste communities and religious communities are defined in the context of livelihoods in that programming. And I feel that there is a lot of potential to have this exchange where programming and alliances who are working with a focus can actually intersect their thematic with another, because all of those are actually combined the experiences of the communities we're working with. It's just that we probably can exchange best practices and do some kind of capacity building with each other, that one organization can definitely, for example, learn how to talk about masculinities when they're talking about livelihoods as the center of the program. But can an organization that works in gender and masculinities with boys also address issues of livelihoods and how that kind of vulnerability itself is informing their masculinity and the outcome on all the people around them as well. So this kind of labor, a lot of different networks are doing, but I think it's also important to bring all of these together in some way. And I feel that the Alliance and even regional and country level MenEngage organizations can definitely reflect on whether there is merit on working a little more cross-sector and cross-issue. And I'm happy that some of these intersections have been explored within the symposium. especially because I was also studying for some of the sessions that we were doing on climate justice and masculinities. That is a great example of how that conversation can begin. But I think it can happen in many more issues that are also central to the experience of young men and boys, and some of the marginalizations that they also may be facing as well. So just would end with that.
Great. So many good points there about connecting the dots between movements and about, as you said, kind of expanding the definition or expanding the scope of what masculinity's work is. Thanks for that. Before we go for Marcus, I wanted to give you the opportunity if you wanted to come in on either the issue of partnerships or on strengthening the youth reference group. If you have anything to say, if not, I'll move on to the fourth goal.
With partnerships, I would just say who values partnerships and who is a partner. It could be beyond just partnerships with youth and youth groups, but I really think that partnerships for a cause is kind of the fundamentals of what we want. We want to see collective efforts on issues versus a pushback on the war of youth or a pushback on establish excluding groups. I think we need to see collective efforts on social issues, because then we could run the risk of having youth backlash on senior groups, which isn't kind of we don't want that kind of revenge thinking just because they've been excluded, and what we're doing is perpetuating, reproducing the same kind of thinking that those before us have created. So we have to be very careful with how we engage in partnerships. And I stick to my point about succession planning as a way of starting the conversation about building the group, the governance, and the culture around how does the next generation see themselves as having purpose, being valued by those before them. So yeah.
Great, thanks, Marcus. So Goal 4 is all about kind of advocacy and accountability in this work. So I wonder, Pamela, if you had any thoughts on how we can ensure that young people are leading the Alliance's work on advocacy.
Creo que, bueno, retomando mucho de lo que ya se ha mencionado, para la advocacy, creo que es necesario, uno, dar voz de aquello que es importante y que, bueno, y Sagar lo estaba diciendo, finalmente la juventud sabe lo que quiere, sabe lo que necesita, entonces dejar de ser esta idea de la advocacy como algo inalcanzable, como algo que uno tiene que estar mucho tiempo pensándolo y preparándose, y quizás es más simple que eso, y quizás es más directo que eso. Y creo que al dar voces y un poco de organización a estos grupos juveniles o voces juveniles, es posible generar una buena agenda de advocacy desde la juventud. Creo que, como se ha dicho muchas veces, creo que está todo medio top-down y muy desde el adultocentrismo, pensando qué es lo que la juventud necesita, sin preguntar qué es lo que necesitan, o sea, finalmente sin escucharnos. Creo que esa idea de pensar qué es lo que necesita el otro ha sido uno de los grandes errores de la sociedad que nos ha llevado a estar donde estamos y generando esta necesidad de las transformaciones, porque justamente alguien antes pensó que esto era lo que necesitábamos. Y ese alguien generalmente son personas que están en posiciones de poder y que solamente quieren mantener un status quo para no soltar el poder. Entonces, finalmente, si seguimos pensando en esta lógica adultocentrista y de unos contra otros, porque al final es eso, es muy difícil avanzar. Entonces, creo que, claro, por un lado, hay que dar esa voz Y también, lo que decía Marcus, tampoco es la idea de entrar en esta lógica bien violenta de, ya, entonces ahora los jóvenes somos los que tenemos la verdad y todo lo que dijeron los viejos era mentira. Tampoco es eso la idea, sino que generar conversaciones, generar respuestas, soluciones consensuadas. Creo que la horizontalidad que están presentando los grupos juveniles es algo que el mundo adulto debiese tomar muy en cuenta. La forma de trabajo de los grupos juveniles, de los movimientos juveniles, es algo que le hace falta al mundo adulto, a las organizaciones adultas. Entonces, desde ahí, generar advocacy sale solo, no sé. Creo que hay que darle la oportunidad a la horizontalidad. Y creo que los movimientos juveniles nos están dando cátedra sobre cómo llevar adelante una horizontalidad y una colaboración genuina y que está funcionando. Finalmente es eso. Y que no lo hace solo por ellos para mantener cierto poder o para decir la juventud somos mejores que los viejos, sino que lo están haciendo justamente por sus viejos, por sus familias y por los que vienen. Entonces creo que desde ahí el advocacy, mantener agendas que sean desde y para juventudes y la sociedad es fundamental, dando ese espacio como desde sus propios términos. Al final es eso, es escuchar, es fomentar la horizontalidad. Yo creo que me quedaría con esa idea, fomentar la horizontalidad.
Right. Yeah, I think there's so much that can be learned from youth movements. I think this question of advocacy, I think, will be such an important part of this strategy, kind of not just incorporating young people into the advocacy that we're already doing as MenEngage Alliance, but to listen to the youth movements that are out there, learning from them, incorporating their demands, standing in solidarity with them in our advocacy work. I think that's so important. So conscious of time, I want to invite Hassan back in to see if there's been any questions from the audience, and do feel free to answer to ask any more questions now. Hassan.
Okay, so going to the questions, the first one, okay, I'm going to set the questions all together and or one by one, because it's targeted to all of us. So how does one person join the youth reference group? This is one. And what support is available for youth-led and youth-serving organizations to get? Is the strategy going to be implemented in Sierra Leone? And if it's going to be implemented also in Ghana? And the question about support services leads me to ask how the strategy thinks about youth organization versus youth directly. Are we talking about connecting youth directly in the network primarily, or connecting with organizations? And I wanted to know how it will work so that MenEngage RTC can get actively involved in the implementation of this strategy. So these are the main questions that were asked in the chat box.
Thanks, Hassan. I think some of those the more ones about the implementation and the youth reference group, I can just answer. So joining the youth reference group really happens through the regional networks. So the regional networks, each regional network picks particular representatives from their networks to join the youth reference group. So that's how that works. Although kind of defining the membership model and kind of, who joins, what the purpose of the youth reference group, these are all things that we will be working out in more concretely over the coming months to implement this strategy. And one thing that I maybe forgot to mention at the beginning about kind of where we'll be implementing the strategy is that this is a global strategy. So it will be implemented together with our regional networks and the Youth Reference Group, who are from all over the world. And it is meant to kind of inspire and support our regional and country networks to also strengthen youth leadership at their levels. But it's not going to be implemented in any particular countries. I think that will be down to the regional and country networks to develop their own strategies to do that. Hope that answers some of those questions. I don't know if
that was also a question that was asking, are there any specific or targeted countries or regions that the strategy will be? So you just answered this question. And what about connecting youth directly in the network primarily, or connecting with organizations, Janine?
I'm not sure if I understand that question completely. Can you repeat it again?
Okay, so it was asked by... So if you open the Google Doc, it's number 8.
Right, yeah. So if I understand that question correctly, I think, yeah, there's kind of different things going on here, but I think primarily the connection with young people directly will be through the various organizations that we're working with as MenEngage. So as everything in a network is, there's kind of various levels, and the Youth Reference Group is kind of the point of contact for the various organizations working on youth, who are in turn working with youth in their communities. So we're always a little bit of a step removed as MenEngage, but of course the focus of our efforts are on young people, as the strategy mentions, young people in all their diversity. So I hope that answers the question. And yeah, please jump in with more questions for our wonderful panel. Don't think we have any more. Maybe give it a minute or two, and if we don't get any, we can go to our final round for the panel, Hassan.
Yeah. So please feel free to ask our wonderful speakers.
There's one there, Hassan, in the chat if you want to read it out.
Meaningful youth participation. Is that what you mean? Okay, so Jan asked about meaningful youth participation on whose terms? I noticed in different networks, organizations, and movements that young people have different ways of self-organizing in campaigns, etc. Like formal membership of a network or organization may not be the way some youth will organize themselves. Yet, their commitment and engagement may be much higher at times compared to adult formal members. So who determines the procedures and organizing?
Sí, quizás yo estoy de acuerdo con lo que dice Jan en su pregunta, comentario, que es un poco lo que ya venía diciendo sobre la horizontalidad. Creo que las formas de organización de los movimientos juveniles, de las organizaciones juveniles, que se forman, y ahí haría una distinción, que se forman desde la comunidad, a diferencia de las organizaciones juveniles, por ejemplo, del Estado o de Naciones Unidas, creo que, de organismos de Naciones Unidas, creo que esas están más estructuradas formalmente, por decirlo de alguna forma, como organizaciones adultas. Creo que ahí lo formal y lo top-down prima muchas veces, a excepción de que exista alguna fuerza superior que invite a romper esa estructura, pero por lo general se mantienen en las organizaciones como muy formales. Sin embargo, las organizaciones desde la sociedad civil y desde grupos, o sea, finalmente acá en Chile las organizaciones juveniles que emanan desde las universidades o desde grupos deportivos, han sido sumamente importantes porque van a generar su propio estilo de organización, y creo que ahí es fundamental, perdón, creo que ahí es fundamental la horizontalidad que ellos proponen. Por ejemplo, como les decía, acá en Latinoamérica han fructificado muy bien las asambleas. Esta idea de la horizontalidad y de las representaciones que van rotando, donde nadie mantiene el poder por mucho tiempo. Creo que eso es fundamental. O cuando acá estuvieron las movilizaciones estudiantiles, las vocerías, quienes hablaban, quienes eran la cara visible del movimiento, iban rotando. Entonces nadie se queda como la cara, como la representación, porque al final son un todo, es un movimiento. Entonces, al personalizar esos movimientos, se generan ciertos estatus de poder. Y eso es lo que estos grupos están tratando de desbaratar. Entonces, la idea de masa, pero en un buen término, ha sido la tónica de los movimientos estudiantiles acá, por ejemplo. Entonces, creo que la participación, la meaningful participation, creo que viene por ahí, viene como por pensar nuevas formas de organizarse, nuevas formas de representación y nuevas formas de ser parte de esta organización social y de ser parte del movimiento social, con nuevos términos, con nuevas formas y con un lenguaje distinto. Entonces creo que sí, estoy muy de acuerdo con lo que dice Jan y espero que la implementación de esta estrategia vaya en esa línea. Creo que así lo hemos pensado, teniendo el Youth Reference Group. Creo que así, esa es la tónica, finalmente, es como tener esta base desde horizontal, desde una base social importante, para ir generando otros espacios de movimiento.
Thank you, Pamela. I guess the discussions are really important and it can take much more time than this, but due to time constraint, I'm going to the final round. So our dear speakers, as a final question, what do you think are the most important next steps in implementing this strategy?
I could go first.
Yes, please.
So, and this was a question I think I asked Sinead when we were discussing this conversation before and we were preparing for it. When I first saw the youth strategy, my question was, what do we do with this? And a lot of people have been asking it. I see the next step to be to make it specific. And by that I mean make it a region specific, down to the country or the members of MenEngage Alliance, what it means to them in their context and what do they want to do it. And by doing so, make it issue specific on the specific issues and identities that this will be implemented with and along those lines, and the movements that it will be speaking to, and then make it action specific in terms of what are the concrete steps this will actually mean. And that will only happen once this same conversation happens at a much more local or a region specific level or a country specific level. I think if we democratize and sort of disperse this conversation much more, we'd have very specific steps emerging. And that is a conversation I think I would like to be an audience member in hearing on what those things would look like.
And I guess like, I don't know if I understood you correctly, but you mean like contextualize this, the strategy to be relevant to the context of each country and then start having like action points, right?
Yes, I think that would be the immediate thing I would really see happening now. And that context would actually help us clarify a lot of things that I think a lot of questions that around the implementation that were coming in the chat would help us think through those as well.
Thank you, Sagar. Marcus, Pamela.
Yeah, I think I'm not sure exactly what stage you're at, but to me, policy is non-linear. We have the opportunity of always going back and forth, and that makes it palatable. It allows for inclusion. I think to me, next steps would be continuing something like this. We are a group of, to me at least, I speak for me. I speak from masculine patriarchal privilege. I think that'll only allow us for one understanding of how this works. Who's also doing who is a feminist, who's doing feminist work. I think we have to engage multiple young people. I think we have to continue this conversation across the board. And it allows for me to ask the question, are we considering our feminist ethics and our feminist methodology as we build this framework? I think if we go back to those fundamentals that our foremothers have created for us, how do we engage men, where men are situated, their struggles, their desires, again, their privilege, their barriers. How do we consider all of those things as we build something like this? So definitely our feminist ethics and methodology is something I would ask for us to continuously reference.
Like pave the way to have a strong plan on how to move forward. Any other thoughts, Pamela?
Sí, yo creo que siguiendo con la línea que plantea Marcus de tomarlo desde la metodología y epistemología feminista, lo uniría mucho con lo que dice Sagar, que al final lo que nos toca ahora es darle sentido y situar esta estrategia en nuestros contextos. Creo que el dar sentido es fundamental, porque si no nos hace sentido esta estrategia, queda en un papel, queda en buenas intenciones y no es posible bajarlo, no es posible materializarlo. Entonces creo que nos toca ahora importante trabajo en seguir esta metodología feminista y situarlo, o sea, hacer conocimiento situado. Y sí, eso es un gran next step.
Well, thank you all for your response. So going over to you, Sinead.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone, for all your wisdom and advice. And it's been such a great conversation, and we hope to continue it over the next few years. Thank you so much. And thank you, Hassan, for moderating with me. You can see the whole agenda on the MenEngage website, menengage.org/symposium, or you can get the most complete information on the sessions through the MenEngage app, or the Symposium app, rather. That's it from me. Thanks again to all the speakers, and have a great rest of the day. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.